fundamental issue in the book of Jeremiah is whether the people will be faithful to God in the midst of a difficult environment. Jeremiah is concerned with faithfulness in every aspect of life. We have a similar issue today. We are called to be faithful to God, but it's not easy to follow God's ways in all places. Jeremiah had to deal with the unfaithfulness to God of virtually all the people. From kings to princes and priests and prophets, all were unfaithful to God. They still, the whole, came to the temple, offered sacrifices and called on the name of the Lord, but failed to acknowledge God in the way they lived the rest of their lives. It's not unlike those today who attend church on Sunday, place their offerings in the collection plate, live the rest of their lives as though God were not involved. Within the framework of faithfulness to God, Jeremiah offers a number of passages directly related to faithfulness to God in the wholeness of life. Jeremiah did not introduce many new principles or commands. Instead, he accepted those revealed in earlier books of the Bible, particularly the Law of Moses. He then reproached God's people that were not following God's law, and warned that this will bring disaster upon them. When disaster came, he taught them how to live out God's law in their new, albeit bleak, situation. He encouraged them with God's promise that he would eventually restore their joy and prosperity if they would return to a state of faithfulness. One of the appeals of the book of Jeremiah is that it is easy to relate to. The prophet's situation was extremely difficult. His region was corrupt and hostile to God's work. Jeremiah was constantly in danger, yet he could see God's presence in the most difficult situations. Perseverance reminds us that perhaps we can learn how to experience God's presence, even in difficult situations. Jeremiah grew up in a small town of Anathoth, 3 miles northeast of Judah's capital, Jerusalem. While close geographically, two communities were far apart culturally and politically. Jeremiah was born into the priestly line of Abiathar, but had little standing with the priests in Jerusalem. Solomon had removed Abiathar from authority centuries earlier and replaced him with the priestly line of Zadok in Jerusalem. When God called Jeremiah to be his prophet in Jerusalem, the prophet found himself in the midst of priests who did not accept his inherited priesthood. Jeremiah remained suspicious and disliked, an outsider throughout his long career in Jerusalem. Those who face cultural, ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious or other prejudices today can identify with what Jeremiah faced every day of his life. In his early 20s, Jeremiah received God's call to be a prophet. We can time this precisely as the year 626 BC, the 13th year of King Josiah's reign. His job description was to carry God's messages over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. God's messages given through Jeremiah were not gentle and affirming, for the Jews were coming disastrously close to abandoning their faithfulness to God. God was making an attempt through Jeremiah to call them back before disaster struck. Part of his assignment was to oppose the idolatry and evil practices that had become part of worship in Judah. His prophetic work began under the good king Josiah. It continued through Josiah's evil successors, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakin, and Zedekiah, and through the total destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. During his 4 decades as God's prophet in Jerusalem, Jeremiah was constantly derided, a laughingstock to citizens of the city. In fact, he narrowly escaped several plots against his life. Now, when Jeremiah prophesied, they were dealing with the Babylonian Empire. It was the days of turmoil and tragedy, and during this time, God called Jeremiah to be a prophet. The odd thing about this is that he was going to be a priest. His father was a priest, and he was being groomed to take the same office. A priest represented the people to God. A prophet represented God to the people. So there is a lot of difference between a prophet and a priest. A priest would do about the same thing day to day. A priest had a salary. A prophet never knew what he was doing from day to day and didn't have a salary. It was a pretty hard task. Now, when God called Jeremiah to be a prophet, people that could work and get around pretty well had been taken into captivity in Babylon. The people that were left in Jerusalem were not too mobile, didn't particularly care what was taking place in the land. Jeremiah was a young man, yet he elected to stay with the remnant in Jerusalem, preaching throughout a very difficult time. At the beginning of the book, we read, "Now the word of the Lord came to me." This makes clear that the whole thing was God's idea, not Jeremiah's. Jeremiah's ambition, his sense of destiny, his skills had nothing to do with it. All of this is from God. For brief, this verse is the heart of the prophetic experience. Jeremiah's call did not come from his effort to reach God, but by hearing the divine word. I don't really know how the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, maybe by a dream, audible voices, visual impressions. The word was for the prophet himself, not for the community. God had personally chosen the prophet, the one who had put his heart to God and his people. Jeremiah did not apply for the position of prophet, and we do not read anywhere that he accepted God's call to be his mouthpiece. This was in contrast to Isaiah, who, after his vision of God's holiness and majesty, heard God ask, "Who shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." When God informed Jeremiah that he was to be his mouthpiece in Jerusalem, the prophet protested his youth and inexperience. But God overrides that protest by immediately giving him prophetic messages for the people. There are 4 actions of God towards his prophet. He knew, formed, consecrated, and appointed him. These actions flow like a beautiful process of making God's servant. It was indeed encouraging for the young Jeremiah to know that God had specifically equipped him to carry out his commission. The emphasis is on the divine initiative and sovereign choice. In this respect, Jeremiah was appointed a prophet for a worldwide ministry. This refutes the idea that the work of God's servants was limited in his province. God is the Lord of the nations. God doesn't want us to serve him only in our denomination, our community, but for many peoples and nations. Jeremiah responded, Lord God, truly, I do not know how to speak. I am only a boy." The word boy or child may refer not only to the age of the prophet, but also the length of his ministry. He didn't have enough experience or relationship to carry on his ministry. He knew himself and was humble enough to appreciate his own shortcomings. At that time, Jeremiah didn't know how dangerous his mission was, but God knew, and God gave him a word of assurance. "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you." The term deliver is used in Jeremiah to indicate the saving of the people from their captors, the deliverance of the poor from their oppressors, and the safety of the prophet from possible harm, before national leaders. I am with you. God reassured the prophet that his presence and protection were there for him. Why did God not need to reassure him? God already knew the hardship of Jeremiah's mission and was saying that whatever Jeremiah would go through, God would be there with him. As we shall see, Jeremiah would be put in prison, thrown into a well, taken to Egypt against his will. He was not allowed to marry. He was rejected by his friends, neighbours, family, false priests, prophets and kings. Jeremiah received the reassurance first, and then the commission. For you shall go to all whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. The passage then reads, Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, Now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Those few words are perhaps the best job description we have of an Old Testament prophet. The prophet is the messenger of God who speaks whatever God commands him. We certainly shouldn't limit God's message in our concern or interest. It could be the message of judgment and restoration, or a message for a future community. God then told Jeremiah the content of the message he should bring, and it contains both destruction and construction. It is summarised in 6 verbs: pluck up, pull down, destroy and overthrow, build and plant. In reality, Jeremiah's life was a glorious success. With what we know now, through all the hardship and humiliation Jeremiah was forced to endure, he remained obedient and faithful to God. After enduring decades of abuse and threats and outright indifference, Jeremiah could easily have turned his back and walked away. But he knew that was exactly the problem God had told him to warn the people about. Jeremiah's response was God's calling can be a very powerful lesson for us today. God gives Jeremiah some promises in the remainder of this first chapter. God tells Jeremiah to gird up his loins, a phrase that means get to work. I can imagine that Jeremiah went back several times in his ministry to the call of God. The world, Jeremiah was a failure. True greatness is not what the world calls success. True greatness is to be faithful to the call of God. Jeremiah was true to his calling. Jeremiah the prophet lived in the final days of the crumbling nation of Israel. He was, appropriately, the last prophet that God sent to preach to the southern kingdom, which comprised the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. God had repeatedly warned Israel to stop their idolatrous behaviour, but they would not listen. So he tore the 12 tribes apart, sending the 10 northern kingdoms into the captivity of the hands of the Assyrians. Then God sent Jeremiah to give Judah the last warning before he threw them out of their land, sending them into captivity in the pagan kingdom of Babylon. Jeremiah, a faithful, God-fearing man, was called to tell Israel that, because of their unrepentant sin, their God had turned against them and was now prepared to remove them from the land at the hands of a pagan king. No doubt Jeremiah, who was probably about 17 when God first called him, had great inner turmoil over the fate of his people. He begged them to listen. He is known as the weeping prophet because he cried tears of sadness, only because he knew what was about to happen, but because no matter how hard he tried, the people would not listen. He found no human comfort. God had forgiven him to marry or have children. His friends had turned their backs on him. So, along with the burden of the knowledge of impending judgment, he also must have felt very lonely. God knew that this was the best course for Jeremiah, because he went on to tell him how horrible conditions would be in a short time, babies, children, and adults dying grievous deaths, their bodies unable to be buried and their flesh devoured by the birds. Obviously, the people of Israel had become so hardened by the numbing effect of sin that they no longer believed God, nor did they fear him. Jeremiah preached for 40 years, and not once did he see any real success in changing or softening the hearts and minds of his stubborn, idolatrous people. Other prophets of Israel witnessed success, at least for a little while. Not Jeremiah. He was speaking to a brick wall. However, his words were not wasted. Jeremiah tried to make the people understand their problem was a lack of belief, trust, and faith in God, along with an absence of fear, which caused them to take him for granted. The nation of Israel had stopped putting God first, and had replaced him with false gods, those that would not make them feel guilty or convict them of sin. God had delivered his people from bondage in Egypt, had performed miracles before them, had even parted the waters of the sea for them. In spite of all of these displays of God's power, they returned to the false practices they had learned in Egypt. God finally turned them over to their idolatry, saying, "Go ahead then, do what you promised, keep your vows." Jeremiah's constant loneliness and isolation finally got the best of him, and he became very discouraged. He sank into a quagmire. Many believers seem to get stuck when they think their efforts are not making a difference and time is ticking away. Jeremiah was emotionally spent, even to the point of doubting God, but God was not done with him. God told him, "If you repent, I will restore you that you may serve me. If you utter worthy but not worthless words, you will be my spokesman. Let this people turn to you, and you must not turn to them." When we read the book of Jeremiah, it appears that he and God carried on conversations constantly, and yet even he was guilty of harbouring doubt. What we learn from the life of Jeremiah is the comfort of knowing that, just like every believer, even the great prophets of God can experience rejection, depression, and discouragement in their walk with the Lord. It's a normal part of growing spiritually, because our sinful nature fights against our new nature, that which is born of the Spirit of God. But just as Jeremiah found, we can know that faithfulness of our God is infinite, even when we are unfaithful to him. Jeremiah was indeed given the task of delivering an unpopular and convicting message to Israel, one that caused him great mental anguish, as well as making him despised in the eyes of his people. Those in Israel in Jeremiah's day did not want to hear what he had to say, and his constant warning of judgment annoyed them. This is true of the world today, as believers who are following God's instructions are warning the lost and dying world of impending judgment. Even though most are not listening, we must persevere in proclaiming truth in order to rescue some from the terrible day of judgment that must inevitably come. In chapter 5, God makes it clear that what is happening with his chosen people. "But my people have stubborn and rebellious hearts. They have turned away and abandoned me. They do not say from the heart, 'Let us live in awe of the Lord our God.' For he gives us rain each spring and autumn, assuring us of a harvest when the time is right. Your wickedness has deprived you of these wonderful blessings. Your sin has robbed you of all good things. Jeremiah adds, but this people have a revolting and rebellious heart. They are revolted and gone. Neither say they in their heart, let us now fear the Lord our God, who gives rain, both the former and the latter, in his season. He reserves unto us appointed weeks of the harvest. Your iniquities have turned away these things, and your sins have withheld good things from you. Jeremiah complained that this people have a stubborn and rebellious heart. They have turned aside and gone away. It is God's land in which they were stewards, and they were called to work in the fear of the Lord. Fear of God is often used in the Old Testament as a synonym for living in response to God. But Jeremiah pointed out they had no awareness of God as the source of the rains and the assurance of the harvest. They do not say in their hearts, let us fear our God. Thus they are unfaithful, imagining themselves to be the source of their own harvest. As a result, they no longer experienced good harvests. Your iniquities have turned these away, and your sins have deprived you of good. Failing to acknowledge God as the source of good harvests, the people of Judah soon lost any sense of accountability to the Lord for how they worked. This led them to oppress and deceive the weak and defenseless. They know no limits in deeds of evil. They do not judge with justice the cause of the orphan to make it prosper. They do not defend the rights of the needy. Just a couple of chapters later we read, they have held fast to deceit. They have refused to return. I have given heed and listened, but they do not speak honestly. No one repents of wickedness, saying, what have I done? What ought to have been done for the good of all in God's land was done solely for individuals' own profit, and without fear of their God, for whom they were called to work. So God withheld rain, and they soon learned that they were not the source of their own success. Jeremiah complains about the lack of integrity he sees in the people of Judah, that they seem to believe they can violate God's ethical norms in life, then come to the temple, act holy, and be saved from the consequences of their actions. The wording of the challenge is completely unambiguous. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You know I too am watching, says the Lord. Jeremiah is calling them to lives of integrity. Otherwise their piety means nothing to God. I will cast you out of my sight, God says. Our hearts are not right with God just because we go to worship. Our relationship with him is reflected in our actions, in what we do every day. It is possible to go through the motions without encountering God. This happened during the days of Jeremiah. For the people of Jeremiah's day, their religion emphasized a name rather than a nature. They had a name, they were Israelites, but they did not have the nature of a child of God. The Israelite people were filled with arrogance. Their religion gave false security. Behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. The people were trusting words instead of trusting in Yahweh. Their religion emphasized a place and not a person. The text says, then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered to do all these abominations. The Jews thought they could do anything and then go to the temple and be cleansed. There is no forgiveness or salvation in a place. True faith today is built around a relationship with the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. Their religion emphasized a ritual rather than a relationship. The Israelite people were proudly fulfilling the various religious rituals. However, God informs them that He did not command these rituals. People can be guilty of flirting with God. People sometimes flirt with God in the hopes of winning His approval or relieving their guilt. If your heart is not right with God, then no amount of tradition or ritualism will make you right with God. Their religion hardened them to the voice of God. Jeremiah records, "Yet they do not obey me, nor incline their ear, stiffen their neck." The fact is, if you hear the truth without responding, your heart will become increasingly hard. Listen to the indictment Jesus passed on a group of religious people. The heart of this people has grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, but their eyes they have closed. So what does God desire from us? We find the answer in chapter 7. "This is what I commanded them, saying, Obey my voice, and I will be your God. You will be my people. And walk in all the ways I have commanded you, and it may be well with you." God wanted His people to be obedient, to focus on a relationship with Him. He still desires the same today. Sometimes we substitute a cold, dead, formal religion for a life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ. There is no comparison between the two. The theme of the people abandoning God, losing faith in His provision, and oppressing each other in consequence, is repeated at intervals throughout the early part of the book. Chapter 9 records the very strong accusation. "They refuse to know me, says the Lord. Therefore their prosperity fades away," which the prophet words as, "The lowing of cattle is not heard. Both the birds of the air and the animals have fled and gone." As a consequence, they try to make up the loss by cheating one another. They all deceive their neighbours, and no one speaks the truth. Oppression upon oppression, deceit upon deceit. Chapter 9 is perhaps the main passage that is used to characterize Jeremiah as the weeping prophet. He is weeping because he has the heart of a pastor for his people. He's not alone. The heart of God is broken too. And though they refuse to understand, the heart of the people is broken. Jeremiah has the heart of a pastor. The pastor is always between heaven and earth. His or her heart is always torn apart. God has placed a call on the pastor to bring the good news to the people. The perfect God places a vision of a perfect relationship into the pastor's heart. He then places the pastor into the reality of the world. It's enough to make a grown man cry. The pastoral heart is not just for pastors. Those who feel the difference between heaven and earth, between God and man, between good and evil, as if their hearts are being torn out, will have the heart of a pastor. And the heart of a pastor must always be for both. Pastors feel the hearts of the people intimately, because they too are people. Pastors understand, but know the difference. The heart of a pastor is like Jeremiah's eyes, like fountains always weeping for the lost, always looking like the prodigal son's father, for the figure on the horizon, praying for their return, crying for the heart of the people, but wanting to run away to the quiet retreat of the desert. We remember it was the unfaithful hearts of the people of Israel, after they had been delivered from Egypt, that caused the people to wander in the desert for 40 years. And yet we see here in Jeremiah that the heart of the people is not faithful to God. When God talks about adultery of the people, it means unfaithfulness to God. The description of the unfaithfulness makes clear where the heart of the people is. The outward appearance of this unfaithfulness is shown in lies, not just casual lying either. Their tongues are described as a bow to shoot lies, always ready. The lies are prepared to go as far as possible, and to be as deadly as possible. When the bow is drawn, it's intended not just to do harm, to kill. And the sin goes on and on. There's no regard for God and his ways. It causes distrust and broken relationships. They weary themselves with sinning. It means that they will go as far as their energies will take them to sin, as much as possible in every way. And at the heart of the matter is the heart of the people. People who ought to have known God's heart. And it's only in God's heart that we find genuine purity. God's heart is for his people. Throughout the Bible, we find God seeking after his people. In the Garden of Eden, God searches for Adam and Eve, even after they have been disobedient. He preserves their lives even though they have rebelled. He seeks to preserve the best in the story of Noah. He restores the land to the people in the story of Exodus. Again and again he saves and restores his people. And even in our own history, the Jewish race is the longest surviving people on earth. And in that time, God has sent prophets and pastors to bring his people to their true home. That is God's heart. God loves. He loves us enough to send us messengers with a pastor's heart. Those of us who have a people's rebellious heart turn from him. Jesus looks over Jerusalem with arms aimed at gathering and bringing them into God's heart. Those arms were flung back in rejection by the people's heart, and then were flung back to be nailed to a cross in a desperate act of love. Don't reject the still open arms and forgiveness of the God who is big enough to ignore your wrongdoing, but spends all of time and history searching and seeking you. The book of Jeremiah reflects the ever-worsening situation Jeremiah encountered. At various times he had the unenviable task of challenging the religious hypocrisy, the economic dishonesty, the oppressive practices of Judah's leaders and those who followed them. Jeremiah was the voice of warning, the watchman who brought attention to hard truths that others would rather ignore. In chapter 22, Jeremiah prophesied, "Thus says the Lord concerning the house of the king of Judah, I will make you a desert, an uninhabited city. I will prepare destroyers against you, and many nations will pass by this city. All of them will say to one another, why has the Lord dealt in this way with this great city? And they will answer, because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord their God." He was the pessimist who was, in reality, a realist. He was dismissed and ridiculed by false prophets who insisted that God would never let the city of Jerusalem fall to an invader. Jeremiah's persistence in delivering his unwelcome message over 4 decades is remarkable. He would simply not quit what seemed an impossible assignment. How many of us would have walked away from such a situation? But one of the striking things about Jeremiah was his tenacious faithfulness in carrying out God's instruction in the face of unrelenting opposition and harsh criticism. Jeremiah never flinched in his confidence that God, who placed him where he was, would vindicate the truth of his message. The prophet could be faithful, to his unwanted call because God had promised to be faithful to him. He served with God's promise in his pocket. They will fight against you, and they shall not prevail against you, for I am with you, says the Lord, to deliver you. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon attacked Jerusalem and carried off 10,000 of the most able Jews, including Ezekiel and Daniel. At that point, Jeremiah's role was expanded to bring God's word to the Jews in exile, a fact recorded in chapter 29. Among the captured Jews were false prophets who assured the exiles that Babylon's days were numbered, and God would never allow Jerusalem to be captured. Jeremiah warned the exiles that they would be in Babylon for 70 years. Instead of acting on false hopes, Jews there were to settle down in the land, build houses, plant gardens, marry off their children, and stop listening to false prophets. Chapter 29 also gives one of the most encouraging verses in the whole of the Old Testament. God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This verse was written directly to the Jewish exiles, but in an overarching sense it conveys the incredible patient hope for those, like the Jewish exiles, who have forsaken the Lord. Chapter 29 is, in fact, a letter, as the first verse makes clear. This is the text of the letter of the prophet Jeremiah, sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Jeremiah takes great pains to establish the exact historical context, not only the exile, but the date of the letter as well. Now in verse 2, it says Nebuchadnezzar had carried them away into Babylon. Then in verse 3, the Lord is saying that he carried them into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. His purpose was to bring them back to himself. In verse 7, it says, "Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." When the Babylonians conquered a nation, they would place the inhabitants in various cities, possibly enough for a community, but not enough for rebellion. The Lord does not want the exiles to rebel. He wants them to seek and pray for peace and prosperity in the city. Even in his punishment of the Israelites, God is showing them kindness and mapping out a way for them to have a prosperous life. God then promises them that in 70 years' time they will bring the people back to the land that he had given them. In fact, God gives a long list of promises that he would complete at the end of the exile. "I will come to you. I will fulfill my good promise to bring you back. I know the plans I have for you. I will prosper you. I will give you hope and a future. I will listen to you. I will be found by you. I will gather you from all the nations. I will bring you back." In return, the Israelites would be expected to call upon the Lord, pray to the Lord, seek the Lord with all their heart. For 23 years, Jeremiah prophesied the coming destruction of Jerusalem, from chapter 2 through to 28. Then in 30 to 33, the prophet looked forward to the restoration of God's kingdom. He described it without the defilement of sin. Again, "I will build you, and you will be built, O Virgin Israel. Again you will plant vineyards on the mountains of Samaria. The planters will plant, and shall enjoy the fruit. For there shall be a day when sentinels will call in the hill country of Ephraim, 'Come, let us go up to Zion, to the Lord our God.'" Chapter 38 mentions a man who few have heard of. He was from an Ethiopian background and served in the palace of King Zedekiah. Jeremiah was imprisoned in a well that was filled with mud by the cowardly king, with the real possibility of facing death. There were many powerful but corrupt government officials who hated Jeremiah's prophecies. When the situation looked dangerous for Jeremiah, an unknown hero of the faith who trusted in God stepped in, and what a difference it made, Jeremiah's life being eventually spared. The man's name was Ebed-Melech. He was a hero because he was courageous. Ebed-Melech decided that he would not sit back and watch the prophet's death. Instead, he had the courage to do something about it. He therefore went on a dangerous mission to the king to intercede for Jeremiah's life. Such a mission could have had serious consequences for him, considering that powerful men had been behind the plot. Like him, we need to speak up when our voices need to be heard, specifically for the downtrodden and for those who are vulnerable. The name Ebed-Melech means the king's servant. It seems obvious that this Ethiopian man had served the king with that kind of servant heart because the king considered his appeal favourably. He clearly respected Ebed-Melech's judgment. Ebed-Melech felt Jeremiah's pain. He had the love and wisdom to do something special. He knew that Jeremiah's armpits would probably have been wounded when he was let down by ropes into the well. He also realized the same ropes would be aggravated when Jeremiah was being pulled up out of the well. So he gathered some rags and worn-out clothes. Then he led down the ropes with the rags, advising Jeremiah to put the rags and worn-out clothes under his arms to pad the ropes, so that his body would not get injured further. Soon after, Jeremiah was pulled out of the well to safety. He was rewarded by God. God never forgets us, nor does he forget what we do for him. The remaining inhabitants of Judah continued to refuse God's message. In 586 BC, the Babylonians returned, sacked Jerusalem, pulled down its walls, destroyed its temple stone by stone, and carried off the remaining able-bodied people as captives. Once again, Jeremiah's role changed. God kept him in the destroyed city, now governed briefly by Gedaliah. He encouraged the new ruler and helped the people understand what had happened and how they were to go forward amid the destruction. Despite his plea that they would hear God's message, they put their faith in an unfortunate military alliance with Egypt that Babylon quickly defeated. Jeremiah was taken to Egypt, where he died. To the very end, the prophet had to endure the ruler's stubborn refusal to listen to God's messages and the ruinous outcomes that resulted. In chapter 42, we see the kind of prayers the captain of the forces desired Jeremiah to pray. Johanan and the captains were strongly bent on going into Egypt. They had a great desire that God should direct them. Johanan and the remnant of the people want Jeremiah to ask counsel of God what they should do. They believe Jeremiah to be a man of God, and he promised that when the answer comes, he would not hold anything back. Apparently, the prophet assures them of safety in Judea, but destruction in Egypt. The final chapters deal principally with the judgment God will bring upon all nations, not merely Judah. While God uses Babylon against Judah, Babylon would not escape punishment either. We cannot read Jeremiah without a vivid awareness of the disastrous results of the persistent faithlessness of Judah's leaders: the kings, the priests, the prophets. Their short-sightedness and willingness to believe the lies they were told led to the complete destruction of the nation and its capital, Jerusalem. Leading the people of Israel was the job of the king, priests and the prophets. The national catastrophe that soon engulfed Israel was a direct result of their poor decisions and failure to perform their duties under the covenant. The overall frame of Jeremiah's prophecies is sin, then exile, then restoration, as we see here. While restoration in Judah was still a long way off, the prophet gave a reason for the hope promised to the exiles. Restored people would have lives of work, enjoyment, feasting and worship all tied into one. The picture of planting and harvesting, playing music, dancing, and enjoying the harvest depicts the pleasure of work in faithfulness to God. Faithfulness to God is not a side issue. The New Covenant repeated the importance of faithfulness. The days are surely coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It shall not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another, or say to each other, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, and from the least of them to the greatest. In one stroke we see a restored world. People of God with hearts that are faithful. The people will be restored to what they always ought to have been, working for the common good, because their experience of God's presence in every aspect of life. If you'd like to know more, then do contact us at any of the contact addresses given on this slide. Or, if you are in the Radstock area on Sunday morning, then why not come along for our 10:30 service at the Baptist Church? You will always be very welcome.